The NFL draft is less than a week away, free agency is over, and teams are looking to round out their roster. And so in today's video, we're going to talk about the most pressing need for every one of the 32 NFL teams. But before we get into the video, I want to take a quick second to ask you to please subscribe to the channel, ring the bell for notifications. It really helps us out. If you're a fan of the NFL, you'll love this channel as we release new videos every Tuesday and Friday all year long. Now, let's get back to the video. We're going to start in the NFC North with the Chicago Bears, and their biggest need is a QB. This is no surprise to anyone with them moving on from Justin Fields and holding the first overall pick through a previous trade with the Carolina Panthers. I nearly didn't put QB for the Bears' biggest need just because we all know they're taking a QB at first overall, but they don't technically have a QB on their roster yet, so this is their number one need. For the Detroit Lions, I have their biggest need at cornerback. Yes, they have improved somewhat over last year at the position. They have Emmanuel Mosley, who's no longer injured this season, hopefully. You have Amik Robertson, who they signed away from the Raiders, and you have Carlton Davis, who you traded for from the Buccaneers. But those guys are all a little bit older. The Lions are a young team who don't have any good young cornerbacks. This is a massive position of need, so I have this as their biggest need. Now, I acknowledge kicker might be a bigger need if you're just looking at total upgrade, but at the end of the day, these team needs are not just based on positional, but in terms of what is valuable to teams. So don't expect to see many kickers or long snappers on this list. For Green Bay Packers, I have them needing an offensive lineman, really just anywhere. The Green Bay Packers have spent a lot of draft picks on a defense. They have a solid defense, and their skill positions were phenomenal and all very young. But offensive line is definitely something that they can improve upon in the season moving forward. This is a team that's pretty well-rounded. They did go toe-to-toe with the 49ers in the divisional round last year, and I expect them to compete in the NFC this year, but I expect them to need an offensive lineman to be able to do that well. And the last team in the NFC North, I have the Minnesota Vikings needing a QB. This should come as no surprise to anyone as Kirk Cousins left in the offseason to join the Atlanta Falcons. The Vikings are a team that still somewhat thinks they can compete. They do have more needs than just quarterback, but this is the most pressing need, so it is their top need. Moving to the NFC East, we have the Washington Commanders, and as well, they need a quarterback. This is well known. They had Sam Howell this past season, whom they moved on from, trading him to the Seattle Seahawks. And with the number 2 overall pick, we highly expect him to take Jaden Daniels or Drake May, or heck, maybe even Caleb Williams or JJ McCarthy. Who knows? Either way, it's a quarterback in the cards for the Commanders. The Dallas Cowboys are a team that I think needs actually a lot. Their defense is very good and should improve with the return of Trayvon Diggs. But on offense, your starting running back is Rico Dowdle. And I came very close to putting running back as the top position of need for the Cowboys. But with the free agent signing of Tyron Smith to the New York Jets, I do have offensive tackle as the biggest position of need for the Cowboys, as I believe offensive line, especially offensive tackle, is a more valuable position than running back. The Philadelphia Eagles are a team that I don't see having many really big needs. They covered a lot of their needs during free agency, and so I decided their biggest remaining need was edge rusher. Yes, they have Nolan Smith and Brandon Graham, but we haven't really seen what Nolan Smith will turn into yet, and Brandon Graham is aging quite significantly. He is in his mid-30s at this point, and I don't expect him to last much longer, so as the Eagles, with a later round first-round pick, might as well take an edge rusher and try to improve that position, which is a vital position for any NFL team. Next up is the New York Giants, and this was one of the easiest picks of all. It's wide receiver. You could argue they might need a quarterback because you don't like Danny Dimes, and I'd allow for that argument, but at the end of the day, who has Danny Dimes ever even had to throw to? They need a wide receiver. Quarterback is in the cards likely in the future, but wide receiver is the present need. Moving down to the South, we have the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and upon looking at their roster, I was actually surprised how little massive needs they have. It doesn't mean they're exceptional in any given position, but they're pretty decent all across the board, and so I thought they needed an edge rusher. Now, edge rusher is just a position that you can never have too many of, and with Shaq Barrett leaving for the Miami Dolphins in the offseason, this seems to be the biggest position of need for the Buccaneers. Moving on to our next NFC South team, we have the Atlanta Falcons, and I have them needing an edge rusher. Their offense is pretty well put together, and they've used a lot of top picks on offense in recent years, as well as signing Kirk Cousins in this offseason. Their head coach is Raheem Morris, a defensive-minded head coach, and I think they need to improve a lot on the defensive end, and edge rusher is always the most important defensive position, which is why I have it as the biggest need. The Carolina Panthers are far and away the worst team in the NFL, and they don't even have their first-round pick, thanks to a trade they made last season to get Bryce Young, but their biggest position of need is wide receiver. Bryce Young's best wide receiver last year was Adam Thielen, who's 33 or 34 this season. Yes, they have traded for Deontay Johnson, who's clearly the number one on this team. But if you have Deontay Johnson and Adam Thielen and that's it, that's not good enough for a sophomore quarterback who you need to become your franchise guy with how much you traded away to get him. So wide receivers, absolutely slam dunk, the biggest position of need for the Panthers. The New Orleans Saints are a team I almost want to say everything's a position of need. This team is not close to good enough to be in cap hell every year. Eventually, this team's going to have to just tear down and rebuild from scratch. But as long as they have Derek Carr under contract, they can't totally do that. And so I think their biggest position of need is offensive tackle to try to improve the offense to work with a decent defense that they had this past year. And now to our final NFC division, we have the NFC West and the San Francisco 49ers, who, let's be honest, they really don't need anything. But push comes to shove, I'm going to put an offensive tackle here. The right tackle position is kind of up in the air, and Trent Williams is a fairly old left tackle, so you could get a guy to play right tackle for now, move to left tackle later in the draft, but outside of that, yeah, this team really doesn't need anyone. They're stacked going into the season no matter what. The Arizona Cardinals are a team that surprised a lot of people last year. Many expected them to be the worst team in the league, and it's because they don't really have many positions of strength. Wide receiver was not a position of strength last year, and it got significantly worse in the offseason, moving on from Hollywood Brown and Rondale Moore a year after already moving on from DeAndre Hopkins. They have the 4th overall pick. I would be shocked if they don't grab Marvin Harrison Jr., though they could trade out of the pick if the Vikings give them a Godfather offer. Either way, wide receiver is absolutely a position of need and the biggest position of need for the Cardinals to give Kyler Murray a little bit of help. I think a lot of people were surprised last year when the LA Rams were actually kind of good at football, especially 1 year after jettisoning almost their entire roster the year after winning a Super Bowl. But they were really good, and this was a team that could have used the draft to build out and improve the team that they had last year. That was until Aaron Donald retired in the offseason. I would have had this at cornerback if not for an Aaron Donald retirement. But at the end of the day, the Rams defense was built around a massive central presence on that defense, and I think they have to try to replace that position at least as well as they can. They're never going to get Aaron Donald, but I think this is the biggest priority for a Rams team. That's entire defensive identity is provided on the defensive tackle position. The Seattle Seahawks are another team that fall into that decent depth at all positions, but not exceptional at many positions. So they can go anyway in this draft, but I have their biggest need at interior offensive line. It's just because, well, Geno Smith isn't that great. He's good enough at quarterback. They have solid cornerbacks, solid bookend tackles, solid ends, etc., etc., but what they don't have is an interior offensive lineman worth their weight in gold. And what that means is that they can't run the ball to the level of effectiveness that they likely want to. And so I expect them to go out and get some big interior offensive linemen, try to improve this offensive line, and be much more of a smash-mouth football team, which is clearly what they want to be. Now, moving on to the AFC, I have the Bengals' biggest need as an interior defensive lineman. The Bengals have depth at almost every position, and it's clear they are in win-now mode. This is a team that in a few years might be in a lot of trouble once they need to pay Jamar Chase. Joe Burrow's contract and cap hit becomes much larger. T. Higgins leaves in free agency, etc., etc. But for now, the team has pretty good depth all across the field, and it's clear they are in win-now mode. The one thing they did lose in the offseason is interior defensive lineman DJ Reader, who signed with the Detroit Lions. And so, because of that, I just put their biggest position of need as interior defensive line if we're only talking this season, which I am because the Bengals should be in win-now mode. Next up in the AFC North, we have the Cleveland Browns, who also I have needing an interior defensive lineman. This is a team in a similar situation to the Cincinnati Bengals, where they have pretty good depth all across the field. They have their quarterback, although I don't think Deshaun Watson is that good. They have good wide receivers, tight end, decent offensive line, some good pass rushers, defensive backs. But what they're missing is a big boy in the middle, an interior defensive lineman. So I have this as the biggest position of need. It's going to be interesting because I have a lot of teams needing interior defensive linemen, but there's not that many great interior defensive linemen on the board, so it'll be interesting to see what teams do with this need. Next up, we have the Baltimore Ravens, and it's a trend in the AFC North where all these teams are pretty well-rounded and built to win now. Jesus Christ, this division's going to be an absolute gauntlet. I mean, it was last year, and it's going to continue to be. Every team had a winning record last year, and they all seem to get better this offseason. But for the Ravens, I have their biggest need is just anyone on the offensive line. They traded away Morgan Moses to the Jets this offseason. They don't have a great interior offensive line, so just anyone on the offensive line would be good. Another position of need might be wide receiver, but I trust the wide receivers they have, especially with Zay Flowers. And at the end of the day, you already have Mark Andrews and Isaiah Likely to round out your receiving core, and Lamar Jackson's going to want to run it a lot anyway. And again, Pittsburgh Steelers, another AFC North team, another team that's pretty well-rounded. I have their biggest need at offensive tackle. I feel when you have a really well-rounded team, typically what you end up needing the most is either offensive linemen or defensive linemen, just because you can never have enough of them, and I feel these positions are always super undervalued. For the Steelers, I don't feel they have any true lifetime bookend tackles, and so why not target that in the draft if you're comfortable everywhere else, which I think the Steelers should be. Wide receiver is another potential position, but we already saw them jettison Deontay Johnson in the offseason, showing they really don't maybe feel this is a position of need, and George Pickens is gonna be pretty pissed if you bring in a top-tier wide receiver anyway. That might have been why they got rid of Deontay Johnson in the first place, so just get an offensive tackle. Just save yourself the trouble. You don't want another Antonio Brown. Moving on to the AFC East, we have the Buffalo Bills, and their biggest positional need is wide receiver, as we all know. Let's move on. Okay, let's talk a little bit about this. I mean, Stephon Diggs moved on to the Texans in a trade this offseason. Gabe Davis signed with the Jaguars, and the best wide receiver left on the Bills is Khalil Shakir at this point in time. Yes, the Bills lost a lot of other positions in their mass exodus in their cap reckoning this offseason, but wide receiver is clearly the biggest position of need. They need to get that offense just a little bit better to give Josh Allen a chance against guys like Patrick Mahomes and Joe Burrow in the gauntlet of the AFC, so wide receiver. Moving on to the Miami Dolphins, and I love the difference in the brightness of the Miami picture compared to the darkness of the Buffalo picture, and I'm not making fun of Buffalo. Trust me, I live much closer to Buffalo than I do to Miami. I'm only a couple hours away from Buffalo. I'm way over a couple hour flight away from Miami. But the Dolphins, they need a couple things. I think it's mainly to do with their offensive and defensive line, with them losing Robert Hunt and Christian Watkins in free agency this offseason. But offensive line, I think, is the bigger need for the Dolphins, and so I have that as offensive line. It could be interior, it could be exterior, anywhere on the offensive line is fine, but the Dolphins definitely need to improve the offensive line. Next up are the New York Jets, and coming into this offseason, I would have expected to say the Jets' biggest need was offensive tackle. Bar none. But they addressed that through free agency and trades. They signed Tyron Smith, they traded for Morgan Moses, and the next biggest need was wide receiver. But they signed Mike Williams after he was cut by the Chargers. And so now there's no real massive position of need for the Jets. Their defense was already really good. They filled most of the holes in that offense. I still don't love this team all around. I don't even think they'll make the playoffs personally. But their biggest position of need right now is probably tight end, and I definitely see them going after a guy like Brock Bowers at the 10th overall pick. Our last AFC East team is the New England Patriots, and this is another super easy one. They need a QB. They've already moved on from Mac Jones, sending him off to the Jaguars for a 6th-round pick. They have the 3rd overall pick. They're going to have one of Drake May, Jaden Daniels, or Caleb Williams, or J.J. McCarthy if they want him, available. And so, yeah, QB for the Patriots. Let's move on. The Indianapolis Colts were a big surprise in the 2023 season, and I expect this team to only get better. They do still have some holes on the team, but I think their biggest hole is at cornerback, and so I expect them to fill this in the draft. I expect them to target one in the 1st round, and this could really improve a defense to go in hand with an offense that was already exceptional in 2023, in spite their 1st-round quarterback, Anthony Richardson, missing the majority of the season. Our next AFC South team is the Jacksonville Jaguars, and I also have them needing a cornerback. You could maybe argue they need a wide receiver because they lost Calvin Ridley, but they did sign Gabe Davis, who is not as good, yes, but still rounds out a good receiver group with Zay Jones and with Christian Kirk, as well as Evan Engram at tight end. So I think their offense is pretty set. They attacked the tackle position in the 1st round last year with Anton Harrison, who had a decent season, and they retained Josh Allen, the defensive end Josh Allen, in the offseason. So cornerback is really the one position of need for this team. I do expect the AFC South to actually be very competitive this coming year. I'm kind of excited for that division. Next up are the Houston Texans, and the Texans shocked everyone last year. They were widely expected to be one of the worst teams in the NFL, And instead, they went on to make the playoffs and even win a playoff game along with the AFC South Division. Now, that was off the back of a very easy schedule that they will not have moving forward this season, but they did round out a lot of positional needs in the offseason, especially at running back. And so I really have their biggest need as interior defensive linemen. They were heavily linked to Chris Jones had he made it to the free agency market and not signed with the Kansas City Chiefs before free agency began. And so because of that, I think the Texans are going to be most needing of an interior defensive lineman, which they don't really have to go alongside Danielle Hunter and Will Anderson on the edges. And our last AFC South team is the Tennessee Titans, and I was torn on this one, whether it was offensive tackle or wide receiver. Let me be clear, this team still really needs a wide receiver. But I think their identity, they want to be a run-first team. And so offensive tackle to go along with Peter Skoronski to protect Will Levis and to allow for a better running attack that had kind of been lost in that last year with Derrick Henry not being able to do as much with the new and unimproved offensive line of the Titans. So offensive tackle, I'd put slightly above wide receiver, but I would accept the argument that wide receiver is a bigger position of need because it's a pretty big position of need for the Titans. And now we're on to our last division, the AFC West, starting with the Denver Broncos, and their biggest position of need is quarterback. They moved on from Russell Wilson in the offseason, eating a massive amount of cap on his contract at that. But they really need a quarterback to run this team. I don't even know who their starting quarterback would be as of today on this roster. And so, yeah, this team is probably signing a quarterback. They are not tied to one of the big three or four if you include J.J. McCarthy in that conversation. But I still expect them to get someone like Bo Nix or maybe even Michael Penix Jr. later in the draft to at least compete for the starting spot with whoever their other quarterback options are. I don't even know right now. Our next team in the AFC West is the Los Angeles Chargers, and while they do have a lot of needs, especially after what they did last season, I think their biggest position of need is wide receiver. They lost both Mike Williams and Keenan Allen, two very elite wide receivers this offseason. And yes, last year they did draft a wide receiver in the first round in Quentin Johnson, but Quentin Johnson did not look very good in his rookie season and was given plenty of opportunity after Mike Williams went down. And so I still think wide receiver is probably the biggest position of need for the Chargers. And if the Cardinals trade out of the number 4 pick to allow a team to go up and get a quarterback, expect them to take Marvin Harrison Jr. with that pick. If not, I wouldn't be surprised to see the Chargers take a Malik Neighbors or a Roma Dunze or try to trade down and eventually get one of those guys a little later in the draft. Our second to last team is the defending Super Bowl champion Kansas City Chiefs, and I have their biggest need at wide receiver. I think most people would have said wide receiver for the entirety of the offseason, but I actually wasn't one of those people. I really thought their biggest position of need was cornerback, especially after they traded away L'Jarius Sneed for a 2025 third-round pick during the offseason. But after Rashee Rice had his best impression of Henry Ruggs caught, I do expect them to need a wide receiver because I don't know if Rashee Rice is going to be playing football ever again, if even next season. And with the Chiefs in win now mode, they now need a wide receiver, and this is the biggest position of need for the Chiefs. And our final team is the Las Vegas Raiders, and their biggest position of need, I did put as quarterback. This was a tough one for me because they do have Gardner Minshew and Aiden O'Connell, and I did say in one of my hot takes that I don't expect them to take a quarterback in the first 2 days of the draft, and that's still true. I don't expect them to take one. But that doesn't mean it's not their biggest need. Any team that doesn't have a QB of the future, or at least a reasonable plan at QB, should always need a QB as their biggest need. Yes, I know I didn't put one on the New York Giants, but at least we've seen Danny Dimes be a reasonable starting quarterback, if only for 1 year, whereas we haven't seen that from Gardner Minshew or from Aiden O'Connell ever. And so I'm still going to put quarterback as the biggest position of need, though I would accept if you wanted to say their biggest position of need was wide receiver if they move on from Devontae Adams, or offensive lineman too. All are acceptable in my opinion. So that's it for my biggest positional need for each NFL team going into the NFL draft. The video coming out on Tuesday next week will be my final mock draft, predicting what will happen in the first round of the NFL draft. You don't want to miss that. Either way, let me know in the comments what you think your team's biggest needs are in the NFL draft. But until next time, peace!